there has been a disturbing trend in the modern world, and I think this is something that Europeans should be aware of, and that is the very real danger of civilizational erasure. And as a Canadian, then I feel that it's my responsibility to give you some words of advice regarding this, and that's because we have been struggling with the threat of civilizational erasure for over 200 years. In fact, since the Americans won their independence from the Brits, they have been trying to erase the Canadian identity. Now, initially, they tried to do this through coercion. Upon winning their own independence, then they naturally thought that the Canadians would want to join them, and especially the French Canadians. And so they sent a delegation to try to convince them to join the American Union. And when the French Canadians declined, the Americans couldn't take no for an answer, and then they tried military might. I've talked about this in previous videos. As we know, it didn't go very well. In fact, the Canadian British forces came down the Delaware and burnt down the White House. That's why it's painted white. So after that failed, then they drew a nice straight border between Canada and America. And since then, they've been trying to use economic pressure to take over our country. And this nearly worked many times. In fact, we are in a very difficult situation. It's very similar to what the Chinese have been doing to their neighbors. They make debt slaves out of them. They make them financially dependent on the large economy of the bigger country, and then they kind of pull the rug out from under them. And we've been in this position for a very long time. But the more recent danger is far more worrying. And that's because currently the Americans are trying to use culture wars, social media, and disinformation to destabilize our country. Now, you may have heard of the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They wear the funny red jackets and famously ride horses. They're kind of police force. Well, you may not know is how they came to exist. And that's because in the past, in an attempt to outflank the Canadians along the southern border, then they established many whiskey forts. Whiskey forts are kind of like these cowboy forts you see in the movies. And what they do is they brew lethal alcohol and sell it to the Indians. But also, through building whiskey forts along the Canadian border, what they try to do is destabilize our country. But in my own lifetime, then I've noticed a drastic change. My own country, in some ways, is almost unrecognizable. Because when I was young, violent gun crime was almost unheard of. You really didn't hear about it. And now we do have experiences of mass shootings, and there's a lot of high-powered semi-automatic weapons in the country. And most of these come from the States. In fact, it's said that 90% of the gun crime in Toronto originates from the States, from guns illegally imported into Canada over the border. In general, then Canadians have good Christian values, they're very humble, they believe in charity, and also they're very inviting to immigrants, people from other countries. In fact, our nation was built on immigration. My father was an immigrant as well. But now what we are seeing is this surge in anti-migration sentiment, Christian right-wing propaganda, and especially lots of disinformation. I mean, Canadians in general respect science. And on top of that, they're generally a very educated population. But if we take my own province as an example, then recently there has been a massive outbreak in measles. And this is directly inspired by this anti-vax mentality of the MAGA people in the United States of America. Also, they're pushing this notion that separatism is a good thing for Alberta. Well, luckily, only about 8% of Albertans really want to leave Canada. Of course, it would be insane. And on top of that, 59% of Albertans want to stay very strongly within Canada. It's kind of naive, but this narrative has been sold to the Albertans. And they can identify with some of the mentality of the MAGA movement, for example. We've had something similar in Canada called the Freedom Convoy. It happened when I was in retreat, so I'm not very familiar about it, but I am familiar with this type of thinking, this way of thinking. And generally these people have kind of spurious ideas about science and medicine, and also have bought into a false narrative about basically how countries work and how nations work. I mean, the idea that Alberta would be able to survive on its own is based on this notion that we have lots of oil, but it's a lot more complicated than that. In general, what people who push disinformation do is they spread half-truths that sound appealing. And also what they do is they appeal to people's outrage. They appeal to their anger, and in that way try to corrupt them. And this is certainly what's happened in Alberta. But the truth is that most Albertans, the people from my province, can see what a mess the United States is. And of course they don't want to join that, or they don't want to become like that. And also, as you know, then the American delegation actually came to my province and tried to encourage the separatists. This is like interfering in a foreign country, right? It's very similar to what Putin's been doing in eastern Ukraine. Like I say, it's only about 8% of the people who actually want to leave. But if you look at social media, you'd think it was like 75% of the population. It's complete nonsense. And if you're in any doubt about America's influence on other nations and their attempt to erase other civilizations, then just look at South America. For years, the CIA has been fueling coups and interfering in politics. An interesting fact that someone told me from Argentina, he came to stay at the retreat kind of as a volunteer to experience a bit of retreat life, was that in Argentina they don't really have trains. And I was quite surprised because in the past they were quite famous for the trains. But there was some kind of deal that they made with the American government where they wouldn't invest into their train systems, and so they would have to buy American imported cars. So it just goes to show, right, that in general, then in the West, we impose our ideals on others. I mean, just look at the history of colonization in the Americas and in Africa. We have this dream about how the people should live, and we impose it on them. And in doing that, what we do is we erase their civilization. So there are things about the American culture that basically you don't want in your countries. For example, there's this strong sense of elitism. I mean, one of the founding principles of America was to counter elitism. This idea that we don't want kings and monarchs. But really, it's probably one of the most elitist societies in the world at the moment. And likewise, they push this narrative that wealth is somehow a sign of merit. But in reality, very, very wealthy people are generally quite ambitious and often quite greedy, and sometimes quite ruthless, like Elon Musk, for example. So it's not necessarily a sign of merit, not in terms of what I see to be merit. For me, merit is something virtuous. When we talk about virtue, that's primarily defined by whether or not the individual has altruism. In terms of the Buddha Dharma anyway, you may not believe this. But anyways, as I was saying, my own province used to be quite a safe place. In fact, Canada used to be a very safe place. But now we're being flooded by illegal guns coming over the American border, and also quite a lot of narcotics come into Canada from the United States. It's not the other way around, but again, this is a narrative they're trying to sell. So what is the case in Europe at the moment? Well, as we know, there's been a rise in the Christian right, and there's been a real increase in anti-migration sentiment. J.D. Vance was actively encouraging the AFD when he came to Europe, and he was criticizing Europeans for resisting the rise of the right. So this is just an example of how American culture and ideas are going to infect your country. Something I know myself from being here in Germany now for over a month is that the German people have basically got really good values. They've got a lot of integrity and they've got really good values. In general, they're very open people and they're very accepting. In fact, the German nation itself is made up of immigrants. They themselves were displaced many times throughout history. Many of the immigrants who went to the United States of America were doing so to flee oppression, inequality, etc. And with them, they brought values. But the problem is that now the general put ourselves first mentality, America first mentality, is spreading like a virus around the world. For example, the Americans pulled out of the World Health Organization. They also pulled out of the COP agreement. So other nations have this idea like, well, if America's not going to do it, then why should we? Because we're only going to lose out economically. And of course, this is disastrous for the planet. So you can see this is kind of like an invasive disease, this mentality. Selfishness and the idea of rewriting history is not something that's going to benefit us. For example, if the AFD do get into power, and then they decide to start rewriting history, for example, removing plaques from walls that talk about Nazi atrocities, memorials to the Jewish victims, etc. What's that going to do in the future? This is actually happening in the United States of America right now. For example, there was the famous Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, I don't know how much the Americans know about the history of Custer. He seemed to be like a soldier, right? But really what they were doing is the soldiers post-Civil War needed something to do. And so what they did was they went out and killed all the buffalo. And the reason why they eliminated the buffalo is because the First Nation people, they needed these herds to survive. It was the way they lived. It was their way of living. It was their civilization. They were nomadic. They would roam around the plains. They would hunt buffalo. This would keep them fed. And of course, the Americans wanted to erase them, wipe them out, rub them out. And in order to do that, then they needed to kill all the buffaloes. The buffalo actually became extinct. This was basically Custer's job. And so famously, there was Custer's last stand. He lost the battle. But in the end, what happened was that the Indians were forced into reservations. They had no choice. But this was a systematic attempt at genocide and also to erase the Indian civilization or the First Nation civilization. And it pretty damn near worked. Currently, Trump is trying to rewrite American history and has proclaimed that these interpretive exhibitions that tell of the atrocities that were perpetrated against the First Nation people are not compliant with government regulations. And it's quite despicable. And there's a real danger that this will spread everywhere in the world. But the most important thing you need to understand is the elites, the oligarchs, the autocrats have no ability to control us unless we ourselves are under the sway of our negative emotions. So what does that mean? Well, that means if we have greed and desire, then we can be manipulated. And also if we have angst, outrage, resentment, then we can be manipulated. And this is what's happening in the world. I mean, there's this thing we believe in. It's called the American dream. It's kind of a lie, really. From the very first day, it was a lie. But it built a country. Why do I say it was a lie? That sounds a bit harsh, right? But the point is, all these starving peasants from Europe were encouraged to come to the States, being sold this narrative that if they come, then they become rich and they will have freedoms, religious freedoms, etc. But for the most part, these people were just being used as pawns to build empire for elites, for nobility, for landowners. And on top of that, then they enslaved millions of Africans and brought them to Americas to build the country for free. For example, the White House was built by slave labor. So as you know, then I recently did a retreat here in Germany, and I found out a few things which I thought were quite poignant about the differences between European culture and American culture. I mean, there's the obvious things. For example, the Germans eat a lot less than Americans. The last 2 retreats I did were in Canada, and they were mostly Canadians and Americans. So I estimated how much food I needed to buy based on those 2 retreats. And what was hilarious is that basically the Germans eat about half the amount that Americans do. And that's why we've got so much obesity in Canada and America. People are very gluttonous. These are what we call the kleshas. They're negative emotions. These are the things that afflict us. They keep us enslaved. When we finished this recent retreat, we had some food left over because I overestimated the amount of food we would need. And so I asked if there was a food bank I could donate the leftovers to. And what I was amazed to find out is that they don't have them here because their sense of social responsibility is so much better than it is in the States and also in Canada. When I went to Munich the other day, I hardly saw a single alcoholic or drug addict or homeless person in the street. However, in Canada and America, they're everywhere. And it's even better when you go to places like Sweden, where their safety net is so good. And if you're from America, don't believe this narrative they're selling you, that somehow Europe is unrecognizable. The reality is, it's a much better place to live than the United States of America. America is a far more dangerous place than Europe to live. And if you believe what they tell you on the right-wing social media, then you'd imagine that 90% of the people here were immigrants. And it's just not the case. It's a complete lie. Not only that, the people are a hell of a lot more happy than they are in America. Likewise, we've got this American dream in the 21st century, and that is to attract immigrants to come to the States with the notion that they can become rich and buy their own jet plane. Look at somebody like Elon Musk. He's the richest man in the world. If you come here, you can be the same. Well, 1 or 2 people do get rich. A few people are shining examples, and it's really through their own diligence that they become wealthy, they establish their own business, and they live the American dream. But thousands and thousands and thousands of people are basically like debt slaves. They just work from paycheck to paycheck. And on top of that, then over the years, In America, they've invited all these immigrants to come and work on the fields, right? To produce food, to work in industry, to build houses for really low wages. A lot of them were working illegally. I mean, there's a really interesting story. I heard this years ago, but my aunt used to live in Florida. And in Florida, as in many places in America, there's a lot of Filipino workers and Spanish workers, like nannies, etc. Now, she had family in Florida because a lot of the housekeepers, etc., are from the Philippines. And so she came to visit them. It was legit. She actually came to visit them. She had a good job in the Philippines, and she came to visit her family. And when she got to the border, the guy said to her, "Oh, what are you coming here for?" And she said, "Oh, I'm coming to visit my family." And he was like, "Yeah, of course." And what job do you have? And she says, "Well, in Manila, I work for the police. I do secretary work. I work in the office, but I'm in the police force." And he thought, "Oh, that's really good." And then he stamped her passport with a 10-year visa because he assumed she was trying to get in to do work. And it's been like that for years in the States. This is not got to do with Biden. This has been going on for decades because they need the labor, right? They need cheap labor. They need people working on the side, right? These rich people in Florida, they don't want to like clean their own houses and wash their own clothes. They want cheap labor. You know, it's illegal as well. But for many years, it was an unwritten immigration law. The fact is the entire country was built on this. But what inspires people to do that is this being sold this narrative that they can become rich. So it's their own greed that gets them there. It's a real problem for people from Nepal. I was there for 8 years. And in general, then the people in the villages are very happy. But as soon as they get a mobile phone, and then on the mobile phone, they've got Hollywood movies, they've got social media, they see people like Elon Musk, billionaires with helicopters and bulletproof cars, and they start dreaming of a different life. And then they risk everything to come over to America with this hope of becoming like a millionaire. And usually what happens is they end up working in a chicken abattoir, like killing animals or something like that. This is actually quite a common story. In the monasteries, there's a lot of young men and women, and they've become monks and nuns from a young age. And many of them, when they come of age, 18, 19, 20, in their 20s, then they disappear. They disrobe and they go to the States. Because over mobile devices, over social media, they see everything that's going on in the world and they want a piece of the pie. And what gets them to do that is their own desire and their own greed. And I have to say, the majority of them lose their illusions once they come to the States, when they realize actually how difficult it is and how they're expected to work for basically nothing and just barely survive, just to keep the system pumped up. In America, we have this idea that if you're poor, it's because you have failed. But in Europe, the notion is if you're poor, then you have been failed by the system. And so my advice to you over in Europe is that you should be very wary of the potential of civilizational erasure. For example, how much of your media comes from Hollywood? All of your computers, how many of them are run by Apple or by Microsoft? How dependent are you on American businesses, on Amazon? Are your children spending all their time on TikTok, looking at American content? This stuff is engineered to create addiction. These social media platforms are engineered to take away your mental freedom, to change your mind, to coerce you into believing a narrative that in the end is of no use to you. As I said many times before, my advice is that you should switch off your mobile device and spend more time in nature. Talk to your neighbors. Go visit your local monastery or museum. Learn about your history and your culture. Just about everywhere you go in the world these days, you'll find that people are basically wearing American fashion, digesting American movies, and spending a lot of their time on social media platforms that are run by American oligarchs. And finally, if you're not convinced of the dangers of being influenced by American culture, then just look at the country they live in. When I landed in Seattle about 3 years ago, I got the impression that about half of the people were on the verge of a nervous breakdown. You can tell from the way people look. Europeans, for all their bureaucracy, are doing much better than the Americans. Do you want to send your children to school wondering if they're going to come home alive? Do you want them to do mass shooting drills and have safe rooms? Do you want your children to be in danger of having a fentanyl overdose just because they're experimenting with drugs? Do you want your neighbors to live in fear of being kidnapped and deported to some country they've never even seen before? especially for the people here in Europe, then you should heed this warning. You only have to look back to the 1930s to see how quickly the situation devolved. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power, and he didn't waste any time. Within 6 years, there was war in Europe. And in the end, the entire country was destroyed, and millions of innocent citizens were killed in the gas chambers and concentration camps. From a Buddhist perspective, the most important thing to consider is the motivation. Whether economic policies will work in the end is uncertain. But what is certain is that karma is infallible. And so, if you are motivated by self-interest, greed, anger, jealousy, and pride, if you inflict pain and suffering on others, then in the end, the results will never turn out right. Look back to history. How many authoritarian and totalitarian governments turn out well in the end? How does it turn out for the citizens of that country? Look what happened to Imperial Japan. Look what happened to the Nazi Third Reich. Look what's going on right now in North Korea. Don't be tempted by promises of wealth and power. Don't buy into the narrative of superiority and purity. All that matters is that we have love and compassion for each other. This is the only thing that will bring well-being and happiness to our world. So until next time, see you later.